Thank you very much, and thank you to all of you for being here. It's really nice when I give talks to have young people attend, because many of us in the struggle are tired. So we do need your generation to take up the issue. And so I'm grateful that so many of you are here today. I also want to thank the organizers and the sponsors for bringing me here from Cape Town, South Africa. It is a long way, but I think we are talking about a subject that seems to be perpetual, perennial, and ongoing. And all over the world, we are struggling in terms of, we understand the phenomena, we understand the context, we know what the remedies should be, and unfortunately, we're still stuck when it comes to violence against women in its broadest manifestations, including the killings of women. I also want to particularly thank Severia for organizing with her team and bringing me here. And I want to thank Barbara Spinelli, who's not in the room as yet. Barbara introduced me to Bologna many years ago when she invited me to a conference. And subsequently, when I was the UN Special Rapporteur, I conducted an investigation of Italy. And Barbara organized the meetings in Bologna and Italy, in Rome, etc. And it was really good having that kind of support on someone who understood Italy and its context on violence against women, but also a larger context of the killings of women in the European context. And she was part of an expert group meeting that I organized in New York during my term, where I produced a dedicated thematic report on the issue of gender-related killings of women. The reason that I used that term was as an independent expert in the UN system, looking at the phenomena of the killings of women across the globe. The term femicide is not generally used in African countries or in Asian countries. The term feminicide is used more particularly in the Latin American region. The term honor killings is used in the Arab, Middle East, North Africa region. Witchcraft-related violence is used in the Pacific Islands, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, etc. So as someone at a global level looking at the phenomena, I had to look at a term that would not allow member states to say, oh, femicide, that does not occur in our context, right? If I use the word femicide. So I used the term gender-related killings of women. And it's a term that was subsequently adopted by the General Assembly of the UN to indicate that this is a global problem. And as most of us know, throughout the world, violence against women, it's pervasive, it's widespread, it's linked to inequality, to discrimination, to oppression, and a culture of impunity for crimes that are perpetrated against women. It's rooted in multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination and historically unequal power relations between women and men. It's strongly linked to the social and economic situation of women as well. Violence against women constitutes a continuum of exploitation and abuse. So it isn't about a one-off issue. The killing of a woman is not a one-off issue. It's part of a continuum of violence and abuse. And whether it occurs in times of peace, conflict, post-conflict, transitions, displacement. I was in Puerto Rico last week and invited by lawyers in Puerto Rico. The world community has forgotten post-hurricane. And we went to discuss the issue of the rise in prevalence rates of domestic violence in a context of post-hurricane. So the country is, pretty shaken up because it was quite unexpected to have two hurricanes of that magnitude. But more importantly, in terms of state responsibility, the US, this is a colony of the US, a territory of the US, has completely ignored the devastation. And what we're seeing is a rise in prevalence rates of domestic violence in Puerto Rico. And so I was there talking about it. So, even natural disasters, and I say natural because hurricanes are, I think, a phenomena of climate change, etc. So man-made disaster in a sense. You have rising levels of violence, and you would think that Society would be different when you face that level of crisis, that level of devastation. But no, the prevalence rates have gone up of domestic violence. I met an 87-year-old woman who had been, after the hurricane, prostituted by her daughter, her drug addict daughter. 87 years old, you know, it kind of broke my heart that we keep on. It doesn't matter whether we talk about peace, whether we talk about conflict, whether we talk about post-disasters. Instead of a different level of humanity coming in, we actually see an exacerbation of the ugliest phenomenon of humanity. So, a human rights analysis is what I look at, and I look at the specific causes, the consequences, etc. And what are the factors that increase the risk of gender-related killings? And it is grounded in the broader context of systemic inequality, discrimination, oppression, impunity. Vulnerability to violence can be understood as a condition created by the absence or the denial of human rights. And this is a scenario that disproportionately impacts women. We live in a world with the paradox of progressive legislative and policy developments. In most countries in the world, we do see legislative policy programmatic developments. But there's a pervasive and widespread prevalence rate of violence against women. And this raises questions about the efforts of the state and also the international community and the regional human rights systems. Transformative gender justice requires us to repair the past wrongs and to build sustainable peace. But this is a goal which seems difficult to achieve, as impunity, power, privilege, and the patriarchy, amongst others, continue to negatively impact the work of unsettling harmful gender norms, the promotion of gender-sensitive human rights, and social change that is sustainable. Globally, the prevalence of different manifestations of gender-related killings is reaching alarming proportions. Every country that I visited during my time as the mandate holder, the killings of women statistics were going up. And, you know, the argument by the state, by the government would be, well, it's more visible. Well, we are disaggregating data. And so instead of putting all the killings into the category of murder, we are disaggregating the data, and that's why we can see a higher prevalence rate. Civil society, the shelters, service providers have a different view. For them, the numbers are going up. It's not just about visibility. The numbers are going up as well. And culturally and socially embedded, the manifestations continue to be accepted, tolerated, with impunity as the norm. Rather than being identified, the gender-related killings, as a new form of violence, these killings are the extreme manifestations of extreme forms of existing violence against women. They're not isolated incidents which arise suddenly and unexpectedly, but it is the ultimate act of violence that is experienced in a continuum of violence. Women subjected to continuous violence and living under conditions of gender-based oppression and threat are always on death row, always in fear of execution. And, you know, just talk to people who provide services to battered women, and they'll tell you this is the kind of fear that women live with all the time. And this, of course, results in an inability to live their lives fully. My UN report that I produced, my thematic report on this topic, highlights some of the manifestations of gender-related killings. These include killings of women as a result of intimate partner violence, killings of women and girls in the name of so-called honor or passion. In the Italian context, I was told that these were killings in the name of passion, and I said, so what's different from killing in the name of honor? Because this is also about honor, right? And so it's easier to other and to talk about people of a certain cultural religious group in terms of honor killings, but not talk in the same way about crimes of passion. Killings in the context of armed conflict, dowry-related killings of women, which we see in many parts of Asia. Killings of women due to accusations of sorcery and witchcraft, which I saw in the Pacific Islands. It was like the Dark Ages, women being identified as witches when something bad was being experienced by a family, and particularly the male members of the family. some woman would have a finger pointed at her as being a witch and having done something to cause this bad luck to fall on the family. Killings of indigenous women, we've seen this in Canada, we've seen this in Australia, we've seen this in the US as well. Extreme forms of violent killings of women, examples would be Honduras, El Salvador, Mexico, where the killings take on a different form. Female infanticide, which we see the killings of babies, the disappeared populations that Sen writes about, and killings as a result of sexual orientation and gender identity. We had a spate of killings of lesbian women in South Africa because of their sexual orientation. The issue of transgender persons is also an issue that leads to killings or acts of violence, and I saw and heard many stories of transgender people in prisons and police detention in different countries who are subjected to extreme forms of violence because of their gender identity. And such violence contributes to the inability to secure the right to life, liberty, and security. The discrimination and violence which is reflected in gender-related killings can be understood as multiple concentric circles. So when we think of circles, think of 4 circles that intersect at every point, and the circles include structural, institutional, interpersonal, and individual factors. Structural factors include the macro-level social, economic, and political systems within which we live, and we live in a very toxic world currently. Institutional factors include formal and informal social networks and institutions. Interpersonal factors include personal relationships with partners, family members within the community, and individual factors include personality factors and also the individual's capacity to respond to violence. Violence has been affirmed as a violation of the rights and fundamental freedoms of women in human rights policies and human rights monitoring bodies. The killings of women constitutes a violation of, amongst others, the right to life, to equality, to dignity, to non-discrimination, and the right not to be subjected to torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Through the interpretive work, so in international law, we do not have a legally binding instrument or provisions, even in the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. We do not have any articles which oblige states to respond to prevent, and to eliminate violence against women. I have 7 minutes. So CEDAW, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights in Article 6, the right to life is guaranteed in the Covenant rather than in CEDAW. And the monitoring bodies have looked at this issue, looked at different forms of gender-related killings. My successor in the mandate has produced a report which asks states to keep a femicide register now. She uses the term femicide, a femicide register, and to produce a kind of report during the 16 days of activism. So that's another international development. I want to situate gender-related killings within the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR, which is 70 years old this year. So the principles of dignity, equality, freedom, justice, and peace underpin the Universal Declaration. Article 2 of the Declaration says, everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. So the declaration applies equally to every human being. Non-discrimination is one of the key values in this 70-year-old document. The declaration also includes the right to life, liberty, and security of the person in Article 3, and the right not to be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment in Article 5. So if we take Articles 3, 5, and 2, it's clear that the rights apply to everyone, and the issue of gender-related killings, the right to life, would be part of what is protected under customary international law through the 70-year-old document, which is applicable to all states. Customary international law applies to everyone. You don't have to sign and ratify a treaty. But despite the provisions of the Declaration, it is clear that the realization of the right to life, liberty, and security is not a reality in the lives of many women in many countries. And these rights, 3, 5, and 2, are being violated in most countries, despite positive legislation and policies. A concern that I have about this 70-year-old document, the Declaration, it is gender neutral. And gender neutrality means the specificity of women's lives and realities is not reflected in that. And we see subsequent treaties which look at specifically the issue of women, like CEDAW. Unfortunately, CEDAW does not, in the body of the treaty, address the issue of violence against women. There's one article, Article 6, on prostitution and sex work. But the issue of violence against women broadly is addressed through general recommendations of CEDAW. General recommendations are not legally binding. They are the interpretation of the committee, and unfortunately, there is no binding obligation on states. State responsibility to act with due diligence. I produced a thematic report in 2013 on this topic to push the conceptual understanding of member states through my thematic reports, but also to get states to understand they have a responsibility to act with due diligence in the prevention, protection, elimination of violence. And I argue there that the state has not just one responsibility, the state has a dual responsibility. The state has a responsibility to the individual that's been harmed, right, in terms of protection, prevention, punishment, provision of effective remedies. But the state has a systemic obligation to have a functioning, responsive, sustainable system in place at the levels of justice, health, welfare, etc. And that's a systemic responsibility that the state has. Unfortunately, most states have the individual due diligence obligations in their legislation and do not think about the long-term sustainable aspects that need to do with causes and consequences. So you can't have effective remedies if you are addressing violence against women as an individual issue. It's a systemic issue, it's a structural issue. There are institutional problems, there are social problems. And so I argue in that report that states have failed on the second aspect. So it's a dual responsibility, but the second responsibility, the systemic responsibility to act with due diligence, is where states have failed. I also argue in my 2010 report, which is a thematic report on reparations as a transformative tool. If we think about remedies, right, in its broadest sense, and if we think of remedies through a transformative lens, then the right to reparations is within this framework of law of remedies, and it can serve two purposes, the individual and the societal purposes. The lack of attention to the problem gives rise to a lack of safety, failure to investigate, prosecute, and provide effective remedies, including guarantees of non-recurrence and recurrence and reparations. So part of remedies is the issue of non-repetition, a guarantee of non-repetition. Unfortunately, that is not something that states build into their laws, policies, and their programmatic works, and in their budgetary allocations to address the work. So the remedies, in my view, are not effective. If you're just addressing an issue of violence, whether it's the killing of a woman, whether it's FGM or early enforced marriages or whatever the manifestation is, the Band-Aid solution deals with the individual, but unfortunately it's not transformative, it doesn't change the lives of people. The other aspect that I became obsessive about was the issue of accountability during my 6-year mandate. The issue of impunity is very, very real. So crimes against women, the principle, the value of non-discrimination is not a reality in the way states deal with crimes that are experienced by women as opposed to crimes that occur in public spaces between strangers. And so, very clearly, non-discrimination is being violated. Women's rights to equality are being violated. And so accountability becomes a crucial aspect of part of remedies. How do we hold perpetrators accountable, the perpetrators that are directly implicated in the violence, but how do we hold state officials accountable for failure to protect and prevent harm? Now, under international human rights law, the issue of state accountability is not just about the state as a direct perpetrator of harm, but the state as being held accountable for its failure to protect and prevent harm. And if we can do that, we'll get more and more states beginning to think about, because if you're going to hold a state accountable for failure to protect and prevent harm as to their citizens, then we can start thinking about effective remedies at the individual and the systemic level. Unfortunately, we don't think about accountability as a two-pronged approach, that it's not just about the person who harmed another person. We also have to think about when a state fails to protect people that are in the territory of the state. I don't use the word citizens because it's a loaded implications that it's only people with a certain nationality. The issue of the formulation of rights-based claims by women remains an important strategic and political tool for women's empowerment and for addressing human rights violation. So using the human rights, and I know there are contexts where people dismiss the human rights frameworks and the values in there, but it is an important strategic and political tool that can be used and is used. You know, the number of people who develop shadow reports and take it to the monitoring bodies in Geneva, whether it's the Human Rights Committee or the CEDAW Committee, etc., and you can see that there is a failure at the level of the state, and so they use the regional and the international human rights system. Unfortunately, normative and institutional weaknesses results in impunity, and in the cases of gender-related killings, and the current reality is reflected in the inadequacy of legislative frameworks, the lack of respect for the rule of law, and the poor administration of justice. And this, again, it's not a global South problem. It's a global problem. This is not about poor countries, underdeveloped countries. I found this in the US, I found this in the UK, and in Italy as well. So ensuring responsive state systems to address accountability, to address women's empowerment and agency, including through women's participation in shaping the future, and adopting a holistic human rights approach with a particular gendered focus on socioeconomic aspects of transformation are crucial to address the pervasive problem of violence against women in general and the killings of women in particular. Thank you very much. I look forward to our discussion.